we are going to chat about why giraffes are so tall. Is everybody ready?
Yes.
Cool. Okay. So let's get started. So today's topic was inspired by Rhea. She asked to learn about giraffes, and so I wanted to ask a question that I think probably a lot of you are wondering, and it's why are giraffes so tall? So today we're going to do our usual thing. We're going to have an introduction. We're going to give you lots of facts and talk about giraffes. We're going to answer the question of why they're so tall, and then we're going to go ahead and show you the homework options for this class, and we're going to give you some extra resources so that you can check them out later and learn more if you would like. So introducing, you guys already know this, I think everybody probably knows this, but my name is Megan, and I'm Aiden and Lizzie's mom. So hi, Aiden and Lizzie. And I work at scientist.com. So some of your moms or dads might work at scientist.com, or you might be a client of mine or friends. And I have a background in science and I love to teach. So I wanted to share cool facts with you guys. And I figured that while I was doing classes for Aiden and Lizzie, I would invite lots of other people to join. So that's why we're all here today. So why are we chatting today? You can see this giraffe looks a little bit confused, might have some questions. Well, we're chatting because you guys are all out of school right now, but your moms and dads are still working, and you still need to get an education and learn things. And it's kind of hard for us as grown-ups to teach you guys and do our jobs and take care of you. So I thought I would try to help a little bit by giving you an extra class on Mondays and Thursdays. So we're going to get started and talk all about giraffes. So what are giraffes? Giraffes are mammals and they're also herbivores. So if you guys might just remember from our discussion about elephant seals, mammals means a couple things. They have hair and they're born as live young. So they don't hatch out of an egg or anything. Like giraffes don't hatch from giraffe eggs. That would just be silly. And mammals also feed their babies with milk. And herbivore means they only eat plants. So you guys might have seen giraffes in the zoo before, chewing on some leaves and things, and that's pretty much all they eat. So there's actually a couple different kinds of giraffes. So I made this little thing to show you guys. And the kinds of giraffes are called species and subspecies. So species is a word for like different types of animals. So we like to use it as a classification system for how animals are related to each other. And it goes from really, really big groups to really, really small groups. And all those levels of groups have different names. And species is a name for one of the smaller groups. So animals that are similar species are very, very closely related. For a good example, you can think about a horse and a donkey. So horses and donkeys are actually different species. They're really closely related and they can actually interbreed, but they aren't exactly the same. So you can see in this, in the family of Giraffidae, there's 4 different species. There's the Maasai, the southern, the northern, and the reticulated giraffe. And under each of those, there's some extra subspecies. So you can see the reticulated only has 1 subspecies. It's still just the reticulated giraffe. But the northern has a couple different kinds. The Kordofan, the Nubian, and the West African giraffe. And then the southern giraffe has the Angolan and the South African giraffe. So there's the family, or the genus, there's the species, and then there's the subspecies. So where do giraffes live? Does anybody have an idea about where giraffes live?
The zoo.
They do sometimes live at the zoo.
Africa.
Yes, they do. They live in Africa. So remember how I said there were 4 different species, the Maasai, the northern, the reticulated, and the southern. Well, I found this cool map for you guys of where giraffes live. So this is a map of Africa, and you can see the different species of giraffes live in different parts of Africa.
You live in
So the northern giraffe I put in is in green on here. So you can see there's a couple different kinds and they're living in kind of the upper part of Africa. The Maasai giraffe is in this yellow color. The reticulated is in the red, and the blue is the southern giraffe. And you can see they're down in the south part of Africa. So these are all the 4 species, and the subspecies are grouped together by color so you can see where they live. So how many giraffes are there? This is another really interesting question. And it depends on the subspecies and the species that you're looking at. So I made this chart for you guys, and they're grouped by the species. So you can see the Maasai giraffe that only has the one species is that big blue bar. And there's about, I think, 37,000 of those types of giraffe. The next little bar is the northern giraffe, and you can see there's not really very many of those. I think there's about 5,600 of those giraffes. And of that, you can see that little tiny green bar, that's the West African giraffe, and there's not very many of those at all. There's like 600 of them in the wild. So all those different subspecies make up the bigger species, and you can see the northern is the least populated of all of them. So I wanted to make this so that you guys could compare it to something that you know. So this is the population of different animals compared to different cities. So Aiden and Lizzie and Oliver live in the city of Madison, Wisconsin. There's about 255,000 people that live there. So it's way up here. There's about 111,000 giraffes total in the world, and that's way down here. So there's less giraffes than live in this city. In Union City, where Rhea lives, there's about 75,000 people. In Solana Beach, where some of you guys live, there's about 13,000 people. And then if you think about comparing that to other animals, you can see the Sumatran orangutan, there's only 6,600 of those in the whole world, going down to 900 mountain gorillas, 160 California condors, and only 60 Javan rhinos. So it's important to think about this in comparison to other populations. And while giraffes aren't as uncommon as some of these really other critically endangered animals, they're also not that populous if you think about the size of the cities that we live in. So that brings me to the next question, are giraffes endangered? So you guys have probably heard the word endangered before, and giraffes are listed as vulnerable. So there's a kind of a spectrum or a range of how endangered or how concerned we should be about animal populations. And that's put out by the IUCN, and they published this thing called a red list of threatened species. And that group was founded in 1964, so they've been around for a while. And they basically take an inventory or make a whole list of all the animal species in the world, and they try to figure out what the conservation status is. So basically they're using different statistics and data about those animals to decide if we need to be super, super worried about them, only a little bit worried, or really not worried at all. So if you think of something like a raccoon or a squirrel or a house sparrow that you see all over the place, those animals are going to be of least concern, which means we really don't need to be worried about them. If they're extinct all the way to the other end, it means they don't exist in the wild or in zoos anymore. So an example of that would be like the dodo bird, or dinosaurs are extinct. Extinct in the wild is also a big concern. That's when there's only some left in the zoo. I think there's a kind of tortoise where there's only one left in the whole world, and he lives in a zoo. So he's an extinct in the wild. But the giraffe is in the middle. As a whole, the group of giraffes is vulnerable. So it does mean that we need to be worried about them. And 2 of the species that we talked about, or the subspecies, are actually endangered. So they're a little bit further along on the list of things we need to be concerned about. So that would be the one that I showed you, that little tiny green line where there's only like 600 of them. We need to be super worried about that kind of giraffe. So another question that this led to is, how big are giraffes? And so I wanted to show you this comparison slide. So if your moms or dads are pretty tall, maybe they're 6 feet tall, I'm pretty short, so I'm not this tall. But this little baby giraffe is standing next to a 6 foot tall guy. So that's how big they are right when they're born. When they grow up, they get to be about 18 feet tall. They can be a little bit taller, but they're usually around 18 feet tall, and that's about 5.5 meters. And then they can weigh between 2,400 and 4,200 pounds, which is about 1,000 to 2,000 kilograms. So they actually do get very, very big and very, very tall. So if you guys have seen them at the zoo, their heads are way up above us, and they're eating things from tall trees or tall feeders. They're very big, tall animals. And you can see, I found this cool picture. Do you guys know what this is? Any guesses? Lizzie?
A lion.
Yes, that's a lion. And you guys know how big lions are. That's a lion trying to eat, or a bunch of lions thinking about eating that giraffe. So when you see the comparison of the lion next to the giraffe, you can see they're really, really big and really, really tall. So how long do giraffes live? There's not a lot of information on this or data, so we have some guesses about how long they can live, but it's really hard to track in the wild how long they live. We think it's about 25 years when they're living in the wild in Africa. In the zoo, they can live a lot longer, and that's called living in captivity or living in the zoo. So we're controlling their health and their feed, so we're making sure they have clean sources of food and water. They're getting all the healthy nutrition that they need, and they also get medical care. And so that helps them live a lot longer. And so in zoos, they can live up to 40 years. So this comes back to, why are they so tall? And to answer that question, we have to kind of backpedal a little bit and talk about the theory of evolution. So does anybody know who this guy is?
Darwin?
Charles
Yeah.
Darwin.
Super good job. This is a drawing of Charles Darwin. And so Charles Darwin, as you guys might know, wrote a very famous book. He spent about 20 years writing this book called The Origin of Species. And that's where he introduced and outlined the idea of evolution. So if you guys have heard of the idea of evolution before, basically what it is a series of changes that can happen in animals over very, very long spans of time. And so in this example, or this fun drawing, you see Charles Darwin here, he's hanging out, and maybe a distant ancestor of his was this guy, and before that, this guy, and all the way down to apes. And so the idea is that no two animals are the same, even if they belong to the same species. And all animals and plants also compete with each other to survive, because there's only so many resources around. There's only so much sunlight, there's only so much water, there's only so much food. And so little changes that happen in those animals might help them compete better than other animals. And those changes add up over time, over very, very long periods of time, thousands and thousands of years. So we can't see it happening with our own eyes. But those little tiny changes add up, and eventually they can create an entire new species. So to give you an idea of this, this is kind of a little drawing of what we call the tree of life. So it's got a lot of different kinds of branches on it. And you can see it all started with one basic organism millions of years ago. And as those little tiny changes stack up over and over and over again, it branches out and goes in different directions. So, maybe at a certain point, an animal was born and its teeth were a little bit sharper than all of its brothers and sisters or of its cousins. And so because its teeth were a little bit sharper, it got to eat more food. And then it reproduced more and made more basic copies of animals with short teeth. They're not exact copies, but kind of reproduced and duplicated. And then eventually the teeth got sharper and sharper, if that makes sense. So when these changes happen in different ways over different times, and we're all competing for different types of resources, animals can become very varied and really different across the board. So because they're all kind of spreading out and trying to compete for different resources and doing what we call specializing. So that brings me to natural selection. So how I mentioned before that some of those changes happen, you can see if say there's a species, in this example, it looks like there's a whole bunch of elk or deer, right? And there's tons and tons of them. And so they've got more individuals than can grow up all the way because they're all competing for the same resources. So eventually some individuals or some members of that population or that group are going to have characteristics that are different from each other, because remember how I said every single animal, even of the same species, is a little bit different. So some individuals, if they have some of those differences, they might survive a little bit longer, or they might have more babies than another individual in that group. And eventually those traits that are helping them to survive or reproduce become more common in the population. So because they're having more babies or they're living longer and they're producing more of the kind of similar offspring, then say those sharp teeth, not for elk, obviously elk don't have sharp teeth, but as an example, maybe bigger antlers. So the bigger antlers become more and more common, and eventually, over thousands of years, this could be a new species of elk that has like super giant antlers for some reason. So that's natural selection and how it relates to adaptations. So remember from the elephant seal thing, we talked about the special blood serum and the surfactant in their lungs that helps their lungs reinflate when they come to the surface. That's an example of an adaptation. Another example is a really common one is bird beaks and feet. So they're adapted for different specialties or specializations. And you can see some bird feet are really good for swimming, and some are good for perching, and some are good for seizing prey. Like eagles have like those big claws, and owls where they can kind of grab onto things like rats and mice and gophers. And also their beaks are all very different. So duck beaks have like little filters in them, basically. They kind of look like little jaggedy teeth things, but they're not. They just filter out algae and plants and things from the water. Some birds have super special long beaks for taking nectar from plants, like hummingbirds. And some birds have beaks that crack seeds or tear meat from the prey that they catch. So there's a lot of different adaptations for these specialties. And if you remember before, I talked about resources. They're all competing for resources. So if one kind of bird can only eat a certain kind of seed, and you can a different species evolves to eat a kind of seed that no one else is eating, then they get all of that resource for themselves. And so that's a beneficial adaptation for them. So going back to the giraffe, they have some adaptations that are really helpful for how they live and for helping them survive. And I want to show you guys some examples here. So one example is their coat or their pattern. So they're camouflaged actually, and it helps keep them more hidden when they're out in the savannah. And when we're looking at them at a white background or at the zoo in front of a barn, it doesn't look very sneaky. We wouldn't be surprised by a giraffe just showing up, right? Because we can see them pretty clearly. But based on the vegetation and the land in which they normally live, they actually can be pretty well camouflaged, and their pattern helps to break up their outline. So if there's a bunch of trees and sticks and grasses around them, you might not be able to tell easily where the edges of that giraffe are, especially from a distance. They also have this cool tail with the kind of fringe at the end, and that helps them swat away insects and flies, because there's a lot of flies and blood-sucking and biting insects on the savanna that are also competing for resources and trying to survive. And the giraffe obviously doesn't want to give up its extra blood, and the bites are probably itchy and painful. So they have this cool tail with the long hairs on the end where they can swat them away. You guys have probably seen horses or cows flicking their tails to keep bugs away, and giraffes can do the same thing. They also have hooves. So just like horses and cows and goats have hooves, giraffes have hooves, and they're really tough so that when they're stepping on rocks and thorns and things like that, it doesn't hurt their feet. Another adaptation is their long legs. So it might help them reach the food that they're eating. You might have noticed that they have these horns on top of their head, and the horns are actually for sparring, which basically means fighting. So if there's a bunch of males and female giraffes and they're competing for resources and for mating rights, they are gonna have some giraffe arguments, and they might bonk into each other with their horns. They also have a really long tongue. So if you guys have seen the giraffes at the zoo picking the leaves off of things, they kind of curl their tongue around all silly and kind of wrap them around things and sticks, and that helps them rip the leaves off of branches to eat.
They're purple.
They are purple, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. They also have super tough lips. So you can imagine if you're using your lips to grab sticks and things like that, it would really hurt, wouldn't it? Like, we don't like to eat hard things very much and grab them with our lips. So I wouldn't want to bite into a rose or something with thorns and hurt my lips. Giraffes have really tough lips, and that helps to protect them from those sharp things that they're eating. And they also have a long neck. So they can reach leaves on a certain kind of tree, and that tree has thorns and it's really high up because the tree doesn't want its leaves to be eaten. It's trying to protect its own resources. And so it evolved thorns and things to protect itself from the giraffes. And so the giraffes got really tough tongues and really tough lips so that they can still get to those leaves because they need to eat. So basically, they're out to get that food. They want to wrap their little purpley tongues around things. And so over time, the giraffes that had longer and longer necks were probably getting more and more food than the other ones. And so over time, thousands and thousands of years, the taller giraffes were selected, or they were naturally selected because they had this good adaptation that helped them compete for resources. And then over those long spans of time, longer than we can imagine, they got taller and taller and taller. So the idea is that the long neck and the tall legs are for eating food. And possibly part of the reason that their tongue is purple, besides being so tough and their lips being tough, the thought is maybe that their tongue is out of their mouth like a lot because they have to spend a lot of time eating. And what do we know about the weather and the climate in Africa?
It's hot.
Yep, and it's sunny, right? Can you imagine having a sunburnt tongue? People think maybe, this is a theory, it's not proven, is that maybe they developed this tongue with a lot of pigment in it to keep it from getting sunburned because it was out of their mouth. So it's out of their mouth so often. But there is another school of thought on this. So giraffes also use their necks to fight each other. So you can see here, this giraffe is kind of bonking the other giraffe in the neck with its head, and they kind of whip their heads around. I see you guys are doing it, being silly. And it's thought that maybe they use these long necks because they use them to fight. So then the giraffes with the longer and longer necks were more and more dominant and got more and more resources. And over time, maybe that's also why they grew these long necks. But there are some problems that go along with it. So for every adaptation that you have that you think is solving a problem, it might be creating another problem. So I thought this was kind of silly. Things giraffes hate. They hate dropping their keys. How are you going to pick them up? They hate it when people ask them how the weather is way up there. They hate going to the movies because they're so tall they block everybody and everyone complains, right? Or limbo competitions. I bet you guys could win a limbo competition against a giraffe, right? So all jokes aside, even though those are very silly, there are some very real problems that giraffes have, right? And one example is shown right here. And this is April the giraffe. She lives at a zoo and she's actually getting ready to have, or she's in the process of having a baby. So what do you see her doing right now? She's standing. Usually when animals have babies, they kind of lay down, don't they? Well,
Yeah.
if you see this giraffe is standing up and she's also kind of pushing her baby out, right? So what do you think happens to the baby?
It falls.
It falls, and it falls kind of a long way, right? Remember how we saw that picture of an adult next to a giraffe and the tall man, so probably the height of your dad, is standing next to that giraffe right around the level of their tail? Well, that baby is going to go plonk when they come out. That's probably not great, right? So that's kind of a problem. They also have issues with breathing. So if you think about it, their necks are super, super long, right? And they have to get air. We get air through, our mouth and our nose, and it goes through our trachea, which is, not that long, and down into our chest and into our lungs. And it's a pretty short route to travel. Well, giraffes, if you think about it, their trachea and their esophagus that carries their food has to be super long because it has to go through their entire neck. And then their lungs have to be really, really large to pump all that air that they need, right? So they have these long, narrow tubes that must be under kind of a lot of pressure with big lungs and a big old heart to send all that food and air and everything through the system, right? So there are some difficulties that come along with being this tall. And as I mentioned, besides the lungs, their heart. So if you think about it, have you ever gotten up too fast or maybe been on a roller coaster and you feel like kind of dizzy and woo, maybe you see stars a little bit? That might happen to you would think that would probably happen to a giraffe if they're up way tall and then they go all the way down with their head to drink some water, right? All the blood would rush to their head and they might get a really bad headache or maybe even pass out. So they have to have adaptations that control the blood flow to their head so that they don't pass out every time they try to have a drink of water. Because you wouldn't want to lean down at a watering hole and then basically pass out and fall asleep and get chomped by a crocodile or something. That would be very dangerous. So they have a lot of valves and really kind of good control over the blood that's moving in their veins so that when they start to tilt their head down, they can kind of shut it down and not all the blood rushes into their head. Otherwise, every time we saw a giraffe getting a drink of water at the zoo, they would go, ugh. That wouldn't be great. So finally, we're going to get to talk about our homework. And our homework is all about giraffes and evolution. So for little kids, so like Audrey, if you want, or Rhea, you can draw a giraffe next to your family and show me how big giraffes are. You can draw a picture of them eating and their favorite food, or you can draw me a map of where they live. So big kids, for Lizzie, you can draw a picture of a giraffe eating and label some of their special adaptations. You can make a comic about giraffes evolving over time and what problems they might have had as a short giraffe. So it would probably be easier to pick up their keys or go to the movies, but they might not be able to eat the food they want, right? Or you can write a few sentences about the theory of evolution and about Charles Darwin. Middle schoolers, you guys can write a paragraph explaining evolution and natural selection. You can draw a giraffe and label some adaptations and the issues that those adaptations overcome, or you can create a comic about a giraffe problem as either a tall or a short giraffe, or you can pick something else entirely if you want. I thought it would be funny to think about something like, what if a giraffe had a short tongue or a soft tongue? Or, you know, what if they had people feet instead of hooves? Like, what kind of problems would giraffes have if they weren't well adapted to their environment? And then finally, for high schoolers and for parents, I guess, if you want to, you can draw and label an ideal animal. So make something up and show me what kind of adaptations you think it would have. Or you can write a short paper that describes the theory of evolution and explains how natural selection led to the current version of the giraffe that we see today. And as you guys know, if you email your homework to me, I'll put you in the drawing on the wheel of names to get an Amazon gift card. And that's sponsored by my company, which is scientist.com. And I think it's really cool that they're helping us out to do this. And if you guys want some more resources, I will send this out later. But there's some really cool species data and a really cool poster from some giraffe conservation groups. There's a fun facts about evolution for kids thing where I got that fun picture of Charles Darwin. And it actually has a really cool book that goes along with that. And then the San Diego Zoo has a pretty cool site with lots of different facts about giraffes. So that was our class for today. I really appreciate all of you guys joining, and I'm super excited that Rhea got to hear about the topic that she wanted today. So if you guys think of more topics, please let me know. On Thursday of this week, we're going to talk about tracking animals across the globe. So that means we're going to talk about the technology that's used to track things like desert tortoises and whales in their migration and how that works. And then the week after that, you guys are probably all starting your school stuff, but we're going to have to take a break because on Monday, I'm going to be traveling to pick up Aiden and Lizzie from Wisconsin, but I should be back the Thursday after that.